All right. So yeah, thanks for everyone for joining today. Today, we're going to be talking about how to adapt your media messaging depending on the stage in your startup's development. And again, this is all going to be specifically for ventures in the tech industry. So just an overview of what we'll be covering, it's all about building a strong narrative over time. And there are stages to that. And so we'll talk a bit about what makes good messaging in the early, middle, and late stage. There are different components at different parts of a startup's life cycle that are really important to get right to help build that strong, healthy narrative over time, which will ultimately lead to the best media coverage and the best quality coverage for your startup and your idea. So we'll talk a bit about the fluid target audience. As you develop, you're trying to get your message across to different groups, different stakeholders, and different audiences react differently. And so we'll talk a bit about how to tailor that message for each target audience. And then finally, we'll finish up with some frequent pitfalls that we've seen, some startups do that really detracts from the overall message. And, a poor media strategy can be damaging in some cases, but it just is a missed opportunity. And so some of these tips can hopefully help startups be more effective in communicating their message. So just kind of the basics to go over. In the early stage, it's really about presenting the problem and the technical solution. This is really the crux of what we're getting at. When you're an early stage startup, there's a lot of high-minded ambition behind these things, especially more technical solutions. But in the early stage for the media messaging, it's really hugely important to speak in layman terms, especially for tech solutions that may be bogged down in industry jargon. We want to be able to present this solution to the average reader who can understand its use in society and maybe its economic viability, which is something we get to kind of as the startup matures into the middle stage. So this is when you're proving a viable and sustainable business model using the solution that you've developed. This is when you start attracting a bit more attention and proving that your business can scale and, has proper monetization avenues and commercial potential. So this is really, I'd say the middle stage is a really crucial stage for a lot of startups. And so this will go into some details about how to be successful during that stage. And then the later stage, this is about connecting to the bigger picture, expanding into new markets or new verticals, and really leveraging your newfound scale, the capital resources that come with being a late stage startup. So we'll get into that as well. Okay, so early stage, like I said, one of the biggest things that we come across is too much industry jargon. Now, this is especially rife in the tech industry. I've given an example here. This is something talking about automation software, leveraging enhanced computer vision to increase the efficiency of its intelligent automated data ingestion software. Now, this kind of language, while certain startups might think that the flowery language might impress readers with a sense of sophistication, it really doesn't do that. All it does is clouds from the real message and obscures the true meaning and purpose of your startup. So just an example of how you can simplify your message and to really get it across to readers. So software that can interpret and process data quicker, saving time for customers and clients. This is just one example of a way we can really avoid early mistakes and get your message out there in a real digestible and accessible fashion. At this stage, in the early stage, it's also good to introduce the people behind your project. Founders, their prior experience, perhaps some personal stories, the origin story as to what led them to start this venture. Sometimes can be very moving and powerful, and so anything that can be done to humanize this story, especially early on, will help it stick in the minds of readers and editors and media outlets alike. So also we can try and humanize where we can in the early stage. Also, this is about where you can present a long-term vision. Now, in the early stage, you can be rather fanciful and broad with this long-term vision, but it's about connecting your technical solution to a broader plan. Now, because it's the early stage, this can change and it doesn't have to be too detailed. But what you want to do is you want to build excitement around your solution. Why should I care about this new business process or this new efficiency enhancing solution? Why where in society will we see these gains? And so I think those are some of the questions that we start to get onto as we get into the middle stage. So yeah, so this is a really important stage for a lot of startups. And the first tip would be to try by all means to differentiate. This is incredibly important because as your startup begins to scale and prove its economic viability, it's very unlikely that the venture is entirely unique and without competition. And so now it's up to the startup to try and differentiate themselves in what, at least in certain Asian markets, for example, in China, where I'm more familiar, competition is intense. There are always other competitors trying to do what you want to do. And so differentiating yourself in this middle stage, whether that's through the people on your team, the experience that you've gained thus far, product advancements, or developments in a local market environment, any of those things can help make you stand out against the competition. And I think that oftentimes startups are perhaps reluctant to acknowledge the existence of competition. We'll get onto that later in the pitfalls, but I think that really does the company a disservice. Insisting on a novel approach and not acknowledging that there are competitors is really not helpful for selling your story. It's not realistic, it's not pragmatic, and perhaps you don't have other companies that you would consider direct competitors, but indirect competition and other relevant players, it's important to acknowledge and try and find a place within your sector, whether it is something like fintech or e-commerce. Really show how you stand out. And this is the most important part of the middle stage. Benchmarking, this is something that can be used to show the progress so when your business reaches certain milestones in terms of scale, whether it's user numbers, whether it's transaction volume, things like this, it can really give readers and media an insight into where the company is going, and it gives a real sense of progress. Often you want to be displaying this progress in a data-driven format as much as possible to give people a lot to work with. And so if you can provide use cases on where products have made a difference, impacts in society, tangible results that we can write about, that people can see and talk about, it's a really effective way to try and stand out during this middle stage. Any details on your R&D or product roadmap? This is, again, as you get towards the end of the middle stage and starting to get onto the later stages, this is your series C, D, and past that, you want to try and give the audience a sense of where you're going. Now, it's a delicate balancing act because you don't want to get ahead of the product and really jump the gun, which we'll talk about later. But giving the audience a sense of your R&D or product roadmap, backed up with use cases to show your progress so far, is a solid way to kind of get your message out during the middle stage of development. And again, I've mentioned that this, if you can make an impact in society or an industry that you can really vividly depict by changing people's lives, this is what we want to hear about. This is what readers want to hear about. It's all well and good if it's increasing corporate efficiency, but what does that mean for the employees who have more time on their hands? What does this mean for customers in this sector? How is it changing their attitudes? And so, again, these are all ways that you can kind of make your story stand out from kind of the bland, mundane stories in your industry. Combining all three of these will help you really stand out during this middle stage. Okay, now we're going to get on to the later stage. So the later stage is very interesting. It's almost like a second innovation push in a lot of ways, because you've had your success with your core business. You've managed to scale that during the middle stage, and you've attracted a good amount of attention from investors to get to this late stage. So now it's really a question of where do you go from here? And a lot of times startups will be doubling down on their core business for a long time, but eventually as you get to the later stages and even beginning to consider public markets, it's about where the next growth avenue is. And so whether that's a new market in a region, whether you're a Singapore-based company and now you're expanding into more and more Southeast Asian markets, or it can be a tangential vertical. We look at companies like Grab, where they started in transportation, but then slowly as they grew and matured, used their newfound scale and capital to launch businesses in payments and food delivery and related businesses. This is really the challenge for a lot of companies at this stage, because the success of your core business has, now endowed you with the resources to kind of be creative again and leverage this scale to do something new. And so you'll see companies like Didi, for example, in China have been exploring new monetization methods outside of their core ride-hailing business, something that has, pitted them against more consumer-facing like shopping apps like Pinduoduo or short video apps for grocery shopping. And I think that this late stage is where the creativity of the founder can again shine through. This is where the vision needs to really start to become a reality. Now, while that vision may have been shaped over the course of the early and mid stage of the company's development, it's this later stage where those ambitions that may have been discussed in a more less serious way earlier on, we need to start to try and show concrete evidence that of the company's ambitions and intentions going forward for the future. So this is really what characterizes late stage messaging, is that next stage of growth and that willingness to take a leap into a new market, a new business segment, or new partnerships to kind of take the company to the next level and branch out from the one dimensionality of whatever that core revenue, core business producing segment is. And so, I think of one example that comes to mind. In the lead up to Meituan's IPO in Hong Kong in 2018, the company was really keen to brand itself as not just a food delivery provider. They were really trying to sell lots of media on this idea of being an all-purpose on-demand services platform. Yes, food delivery is the highest frequency category, but we offer, or they offered, in-store and hotel and entertainment, travel bookings, things like this. And, they were in the later stages, obviously, of their development, and they were using the traffic, the user base that they had gained from their core business to then cross-sell and expand into new verticals, something they're still doing and adding to the app to this day. So this secondary stage of innovation is really important to successfully driving home the startup's late stage performance. So a bit about the target audience. We mentioned this earlier. It really has to do with connecting to the local community and local media and local eyes in the early stages. And then as you grow, slowly adapting your messaging to make it more accessible to global audiences who perhaps aren't as familiar with the local market conditions, the economic environment, and the way society works, So yeah, in the early stage, you're looking at the ultra curious first adopters, people who are interested in tech, and proximity obviously affects a lot of these things. So it's going to be more local eyes on your startup in the early stage. Once you get to the middle stage, once you've proved the viability of your business model, you'll start to attract more attention from perhaps a broader industry audience. It might not be as familiar with the local conditions anymore, but they have an understanding of, say, how freight logistics works. And now they're looking at your company because you've proven in your local environment to be able to run a business successfully. And so to reach out to these more industry types that perhaps might not be local, you want to start to adapt that messaging from an ultra localized early stage version to slowly try and branch out and connect with maybe first regional stakeholders or people who would have still some level of familiarity with your business and your market, but not necessarily experts on it. And so really just get that message out there in the middle stage. And then as we get towards the late stage, it's about connecting your business to global markets. And that means convincing global audiences and investors that your business model is actually replicable in lots of different markets. And so this takes really some skill and especially market research in places that the startup identifies as a good expansion market. Lots of Chinese tech companies are looking into different Southeast Asian markets as that ideal next step. Once they get into the late stage, they see that as almost a proving ground for international expansion before tackling maybe some more developed markets in the US and Europe. But, so this message really has to evolve from the early stage to really get you the local point across and tell people really the importance of what you're doing and why you're doing it, to then slowly extrapolating that point out and to really try and relate with people from all different backgrounds. And so that is a difficult task in the later stages. But if you've reached this stage, you're already looking at expansions into different segments or markets. And so in the course of researching for those expansions, you'll find similar cores, whether it's economic conditions or social conditions that are similar in different markets, whether it's from your home market or somewhere where you've had previous experience. You can really tap into those relatable points, whether it's something like the lack of accessibility of financing. And so, increasing financial penetration through fintech, or increasing logistics networks to reach more far-flung rural areas. These types of concepts, they are problems in many places in the world. And when I say problems, I mean, problems that are in need of solutions from innovative companies. And so it's about taking those replicable and relatable problems and trying to apply them to the markets that you're looking to move into in the later stage. Okay, so some frequent pitfalls. I've touched on these already, but one thing that just personally really irks me is insisting on novelty. Now, when you're reaching your Series B, Series C round, it's highly unlikely that you are the only company doing this. And if you are, perhaps you're doing it in a slightly different way, then it's okay to kind of acknowledge that there is relevant competition, but you can still then use that to your advantage to explain how the nuanced difference between yourself and competitors. And I think that really is worth more to a startup than trying to say, oh, who are your competitors? Oh, we don't have any. We have this new model that completely, is untouched by any competitors, because in reality, even a new approach is going to have some indirect competition from industry incumbents somewhere. And so insisting on novelty really only hurts your story and doesn't give it that realist view that I think it needs to connect with audiences. So jumping the gun, pushing narratives ahead of the product, this is kind of self-explanatory, but we have seen startups that are very, very heavy on the early messaging. And then, as we've spoken about in the last Startup Wire episode, the consistency of messaging is important. And so if there's lots of very positive pieces for upcoming products launches that for whatever reason are delayed or take time or cannot be fully explained without use cases and examples, then putting out that type of messaging, is also harmful. And it's more worthwhile to be patient and to present the information at a time when there's ample use cases and evidence for this point to be elaborated on. Because again, the idea of putting out your media messaging is to entice editors or writers to get involved in the topic and then to kind of expand on the story from there. So it's not about getting people to reprint those releases. As we know, it's about getting them to bite and then getting into a bigger story overall. And so in order to do that, you really need to time your releases to where there's more evidence behind what you're talking about. And the last point I've mentioned again over the course of this presentation, but do not assume familiarity with local conditions. I think that this is so important because the local conditions often shape the way startups develop and shape everything from management practices to business models. And so to discount these local conditions and assume familiarity for a readership that's increasingly global, I think does a real disservice to the startup as well. And so trying to bring the reader or the audience as close to your solution and to your perspective as possible in those early stages especially is really important for conveying the vitality of your product. You know, how important is this? Why does this matter? And I think that more color with local environment will help drive home, you know, what makes this company or this solution so important, and why this problem is really worth solving. And that pretty much wraps it up for me. We'll open it up now to Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, AJ. That was brilliant. You covered quite a lot of interesting points. So just to start off the Q&A for everyone, I've actually got a bit of a quick question. So you mentioned at the start to avoid technical jargon, which is understandable. What would you say to for the startups that are in a very technical field? So they have, you know, perhaps they're in deep tech, etc., or in biotech, which naturally, if you are sharing your story, you would naturally, you know, bring up quite technical terms. So how would you balance that for startups in those sort of fields?
Sure, Sarah, that's a good question. So I think it's really important to balance who contributes to these media messaging and the narrative. So if you're giving a technical founder full control over kind of telling his story, it's undoubtedly going to be colored by his technical backgrounds and engineering background. So I think it's important to, while it's important to get their perspective and their vision for the company, it's also equally important to get people from different backgrounds to kind of understand and digest the message and kind of put it in their own words. And so it's not so much an absence of technical language, but more a coexistence of the technical solutions with also the layman explanation for how this is going to work for our startup to grow and for our business to succeed.
Great. Yeah. I just want to point out as well, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. We'll be happy to cover it. Just got another quick question, AJ. So you mentioned the different stages and the different target audiences. What about the tone? So you know, you said, so for example, early stage you target local, middle stage you start going a bit wider investors. The tone of the messaging, how would you change it? Because sometimes I think when you're in the early start, you're a bit more, I guess, sort of friendly, I guess, down to earth. And do you change your tone once you go up, you know, more business-like? What sort of advice would you give there?
Right. I think, yeah, that's a good point, Zaro. So early on, you really want to have that positivity, that enthusiasm for your innovation. And I think that really needs to shine through in the early messaging. You know, it has to compel people to believe in the solution, although because it's early stage, perhaps there isn't tangible evidence or results yet. There needs to be that energy and that enthusiasm. Once you get into the more middle stage, the tone needs to become a bit more contrite, a bit more serious, where you need to prove the practical viability of a business model. Now, that has very little to do with aspirations or ambitions. That has to do with on-the-ground execution and operations. So I would say in the middle stage, you're taking a more matter-of-fact tone. You're speaking factually about things that are happening on the ground. And so that is a departure from the early stage. And then when you get into the later stage, it's sort of a bit of both. You need to kind of recapture that enthusiasm and innovative foresight to kind of talk about your expansion into new areas as a late stage startup. But at the same time, it has to be backed in reality. And so, you know, these are no longer far off visions. These need to be new business segments or new markets that you're targeting imminently. And so I think that's kind of how the tone would need to adjust over the development.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we just got some questions from the floor. So the first one is for seed to early stage startups who don't have a PR or comms team. How would you suggest they go about building their comms strategy?
Right. So I really think that in the early days, it's important to have, like you mentioned in the question, a dedicated PR person, someone who at this stage, you know, can really tell the story from including the origin story to the actual implementation of the first, actual product. I think that that's really the way to go. I think for early stage startups, PR agencies are perhaps not always the best route. I think that they can often lack the understanding of the novelty of early stage startups. If you're early stage, you have a unique product to offer, and I think that larger PR agencies can often get lost in a lot of that industry jargon that we've spoken about, because of maybe a lack of firsthand familiarity or a reliance on other third-party content to craft that messaging. So if possible, I would recommend really to have someone from within and internally within the company who can really understand and tell the narrative on a consistent basis.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. The next question is, do you have any tips on spacing out the media announcements, so monthly or quarterly? Is there a good sort of standard process to follow there?
Again, I think that it depends on the stage in your development. I think that during the middle stage, as your business is scaling, it's important to benchmark, like I mentioned, and to show progress. However, you don't want to do too much too soon, and because if you're doing too much messaging in the early days before there's really results on the ground, I think that you run the risk of, kind of blowing hot air too early. And so I think that it depends on your development, but when you're really scaling your company in that middle stage, I think that it's important to keep people aware of the progress in a more consistent basis. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Another question. So for companies that might not have the resources of bigger companies, have you seen any good guerrilla tactics where a company has leveraged a unique aspect or innovation in their media plan?
Right. And so I think that in the current social media era, I think that when it comes to guerrilla tactics, you're seeing more and more creative uses of different platforms. And I think that it's not really only SMEs that are doing this. I think we've seen in the early days of Xiaomi, I remember they had a remarkably low marketing budget because it was a lot of organic stuff on social media. And that was really a point of pride for the company. And so I think that it's a good media strategy is really not always backed up by big spending, but instead it's about really picking and choosing the outlets you're dealing with and the audiences that you reach, and getting the most for the money you spend. I think that kind of spray and pray approaches to putting out marketing materials is really not the way to go. It's got to be targeted, and ideally building relationships with local and regional media at first would be the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question. Do you think blogs and newsletters add value as opposed to noise for early stage startups?
That's a good question. I think, yes, I do think they add value, because I think that blogs and newsletters, as long as the quality is of a certain standard, it can't hurt that much, and again, you need to have certain standards as to what goes on the blog and what doesn't, and what really constitutes the need to know content. I think a blog is certainly more harmless than a newsletter. It's less invasive. You're not risking spamming people. It's on your website. People can go look at it if they want to. Newsletters, potentially, if there's not too much interesting, they can get lost in the pile of other emails. So I would say a hard positive to the blog. Newsletters potentially, but you want to be a bit more careful.
Mm-hmm. Got a question from Carla from Kickstart in the Philippines. Thanks for the question. So she is asking, in the Philippines, VC and tech reporting isn't quite mature yet. How do you suggest we guide or educate local media to give justice to the story of our local startups in the Philippines?
Right. And so I think this question, Carla, really gets at, it's a relationship building exercise as well. I think that patience is really required to not only introduce local media to your startup, but really let them see it with their own eyes. Let them see your solutions in action. And I think that, if your startup is gaining enough attention, that I think local media would be more than willing to really take the time to really get to know a local champion. But I think that relationship begins with like a strong first impression and a strong introduction to not only the company's product, but the ambitions. Because I think that, again, in the early stage here, we don't have really a mature reporting ecosystem. Then you really want to get the enthusiasm and the energy and the excitement up. And I think that the best way to do that is really just to meetings in person and building relationships with media and increasing their familiarity with your products or services. That's really the best bet, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's it for questions. Thank you everyone for asking us fantastic questions. So just to wrap it up, Startup Wire, like I said earlier, it is a new initiative, so we will really appreciate people to fill out the post-event survey, give us some feedback, let us know what we can do to give you even more useful information, and see if we can improve on future episodes. Also, if you're interested in the Startup Wire package or other media options, please let me know. This is my email address. And hopefully we can have a chat and just see what we can do to help you out on the media side of things. So thank you very much for joining, everybody. Really appreciate your support. I hope the session was very useful for you. If you do have any questions, again, contact myself or Sarah, who's based in Indonesia, and we will put out a recording of the session as well for people that want to go back and listen to AJ's tips again. So yeah, thank you very much for joining, everyone. That's it for today, and hope to see you again next time. Thank you.